Alright, so we're leading off here with a pretty good hand. We're going to start on a Thoughtseize. And so we saw with the Thoughtseize, two Lightning Bolts, Blackcleave Cliffs, Blooming Marsh, Tarmogoyf, and a Thoughtseize of our opponent. So looking at our hand, we've got a nice starting opener, 3 lands. We have perfect mana in terms of our colors. We've got a Liliana and a Tarmogoyf as our main threats. And then two forms of removal in the Lily and the Push. Our opponent has 2 Lightning Bolts. So we don't want to be taking a Lightning Bolt here. It's not one of the best removal spells in the matchup. So if we're able to sort of play around it and not make that effect super good, that's going to be our best bet. So we have removal for our opponent's Tarmogoyf, and then so it's between Thoughtseize and Liliana. If we take the Liliana, we know we don't have to deal with that card, but it does allow our opponent to Thoughtseize us back and take our Liliana. The idea being behind taking the Liliana is that we're pretty reliant on the Tarmogoyf, and if our opponent Thoughtseizes the Lily, they still have no great removal for Tarmogoyf outside of using 2 Lightning Bolts on it in their hand. So in this matchup, it's a lot about top decking. Both opening hands are pretty good in this game, and as expected, the Thoughtseize is going to come back. Now, a small reason to not take the Thoughtseize is that our opponent is gonna force our opponent to lose 2 life if we thought the Thoughtseize and the Liliana were equal. There's also the possibility our opponent doesn't hit that 3rd land on time for the Liliana, so that would be one reason to argue for the Thoughtseize. Our opponent top decked a Dreadbore, which is the perfect answer to our Tarmogoyf, and that's pretty unfortunate because, as you can see in this hand, it's pretty threat light. We do have that Treetop Village, but that one does get answered by Lightning Bolt very effectively. We're going to Fatal Push away our opponent's Goyf that we already knew about, but we're just kind of top decking lands right now and that Bolt. Well, our opponent's likely to be top decking better than us, so we see that our opponent is missing their 3rd land, which means immediately we know that our opponent has five spells in hand. So one thing I like to do after a Thoughtseize, if I remember it, is cross off. All right, what has our opponent already played? The Blackcleave Cliffs and the Blooming Marsh check, the Tarmogoyf check, the Thoughtseize check. So we actually only know about the 2 Lightning Bolts that were from the earlier Thoughtseize. And because we know about those Lightning Bolts, we're not trading a Treetop Village for a Lightning Bolt right now. So Bloodstained Mire and Past is interesting. One card that our opponent could be representing here is a Culligan's Command. We draw Ooze, so if we play it, it's just going to get Lightning Bolted. I decide to hold on to it. This does allow our opponent to Culligan's Command back their Goyf, which notably we could play the Ooze and then our opponent could do that, make that play in response, so that our Ooze would not be able to exile our opponent's Goyf. And so now this Goyf is a 5/6. It hits really hard in the mirrors because Planeswalkers go to the graveyard, and that makes it a 5/6. We drew the card we wanted, Bloodbraid. Optimally here, we would hit something like a Liliana or another removal spell. Instead, it's Inquisition of Kozilek. And so we see what our opponent's working with. So it's a pretty stacked hand of 3 Bolts, a Bloodbraid Elf, and a Maelstrom Pulse. The reason why Thoughtseize is often considered better in this mirror match is because it hits Bloodbraid Elf, the best card in the mirror. we cannot take it here, of course, so we're forced to take one of these other cards. I go with the Pulse because our opponent has 3 bolts. We expect a bolt to trade with the Bloodbraid, so that's going to leave our opponent on 2 bolts and 1 Bloodbraid Elf versus our Lightning Bolt, which can't actually deal with the Goyf unless we draw a second bolt. And this Ooge, which just gets bolted unless we draw another green source, because if we draw another green source here, we can play the Ooze and then have double green to eat 2 creatures potentially. Instead, it's a Bob, so I run out the Bob because I want to start making our opponent use those lightning bolts. If we play the Ooze, it would also get bolted, but I'd rather try to set up a spot where this Ooze can start getting large, which is why I kept it in hand. Taking 5 all the way down to 8. So notably, our opponent still has that Bloodbraid Elf, but did not cast it pre-combat, which was a little bit surprising, and is casting it now instead. And that is pretty much one of the cards our opponent wanted to see. Liliana the Veil. So that's probably gonna tick up, and it does. So we've got a decision here, what to discard. I think I like discarding the Ooze, unfortunately, and using the Bolt, possibly to go after the Bloodbraid or possibly the Liliana, but we don't have to decide until we take a draw step. We really want to draw a Bloodbraid Elf of our own. That would be the best draw. Instead, it's a Colligan's Command, so this is a pretty awkward draw. I mean, it's not a brick, right? But it doesn't do exactly what we want here. We'd like to be able to say, if we had 6 mana, we could go Bolt Liliana and Colligan's Command Liliana and get a creature from our graveyard. But one play we can do is we know about that Lightning Bolt in our opponent's hand, which means we're effectively at 5 life if we let our opponent have that Lightning Bolt. But our opponent only has 1 card left, so we can force that Lightning Bolt out of our opponent's hand by making them discard it, and then we can use the Colligan's Command to get rid of the Bloodbraid Elf. We would like to be able to use the Colligan's Command to maybe go after Lily and then bolt it. Unfortunately, we cannot do that because this is 8 damage and we're at 8, so we have to answer one of these creatures. So I go ahead, make our opponent discard the bolt. Now the plan is to bolt the Liliana. Our opponent did draw land. Bolt the Liliana, and then if we draw, we have a lot of good draws, which would allow us to get possibly attack the Liliana off the board, and then have something for the Goyf. A land was not one of those draws, so that forces us into a chump block here. And you can see kind of, we've been trading resources this whole time, but our opponent has just got more sticky threats on the board, and they're doing good work. Our mana actually ended up, at the start it looked really good with the 2 cliffs and the treetop, but then we drew an extra land than our opponent, and yep, things just didn't really come together. So we're forced to chump block here and then hope to top deck something like maybe a Bloodbraid Elf. And it looks like our opponent drew a land as well. But that Raging Ravine is going to mean that game 1 is going to go to our opponent. We exchanged resources in this game. Our opponent ended up being able to utilize theirs just a bit better than we did. Our Goyf, really the turning point of this game was the Goyf getting answered by the Dreadbore and the selection. Sometimes with the Thoughtseize, you have to make a gamble right at the start of the game, which we did. We kind of gambled on that Goyf being important and doing some work, but it ended up just dying very quickly. So we're going to go now into sideboarded.